Hi guys, I'm back. I'm going to read chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5 is called A Damsel in Distress. It starts on page 22 on the book. And when we left off, Phoebe and Sal were talking, and Phoebe had implied that she thought that something had happened to Margaret Cadaver's husband that was what she says awful, purely awful, implying that Margaret had maybe something to do with wherever her husband is now. So she's telling this story, remember, as she's driving in the car. Sal's driving in the car with her grandparents on the way to Idaho to see Sal's mom. So we're going to pick up with Sal again in the car telling this story to her grandparents. Okay. At this point in my story about Phoebe, Graham said, "I knew someone like Phoebe once." "Phoebe," I said. "Yes, that's right. I knew someone just like Phoebe, only her name was Gloria. Gloria lived in the wildest, most pepped-up world. A scary one, but oh, scads more exciting than my own." Gramps said, "Gloria? Is she the one who told you not to marry me? Is she the one who said I would be your ruination?" "Shush," Graham said. "Gloria was right about that at least." She elbowed Gramps. "Besides, Gloria only said that because she wanted you for herself." "Gall dang," Gramps said, pulling into a rest stop along the Ohio Turnpike. "I am tired." I did not want to stop. "Rush, rush, rush," whispered the wind, the sky, the clouds, the trees. "Rush, rush, rush." If all he wanted to do was take a rest, that seemed a safe enough and quick enough thing for him to do. My grandparents can get into trouble as easily as a fly can land on a watermelon. 2 years ago, when they drove to Washington, D.C., they were arrested for stealing the back tires off a senator's car. "We had 2 flat, sprinkled tires," my grandfather explained. "We were only borrowing the senator's tires. We were going to return them." In Bybanks, Kentucky, you could do this. You could borrow someone's back tires and return them later. But you could not do this in Washington, D.C., and you could especially not do this to a senator's car. Last year, when Graham and Gramps drove to Philadelphia, they were stopped by the police for irresponsible driving. "You were driving on the shoulder," a policeman told Gramps. Gramps said, "Shoulder? I thought it was an extra lane. That's a mighty fine shoulder." So just in case you're not sure what that means, the shoulder is the part of the road that's meant not for driving on, but just for you to pull off of in case you have an emergency, like a flat tire or something. You're not supposed to actually drive on it. So here we were, just a few hours into our trip out to Lewiston, Idaho, and we were safely stopped in a rest area. Then Gramps noticed a woman leaning over the fender of her car. The woman was peering at her car and dabbing a white handkerchief at various greasy items inside. "Excuse me," Gramps said gallantly. "I believe I see a damsel in some distress," and off he marched to her rescue. Graham sat there patting her knees and singing, "Oh, meet me in the tulips when the tulips do bloom." The woman's white handkerchief, now spotted with black grease, dangled from her fingertips as she smiled down on the back of Gramps, who had taken her place leaning over the engine. "Might be the carbusterator," he said, "or maybe not." He tapped a few hoses. "Might be these dang snakes." "Oh my," the woman said. "Snakes in my engine?" Gramps waggled a hose. "This here's what I call a snake," he said. "Oh, I see," the woman said. "And you think those snakes might be the problem?" "Maybe so." Gramps pulled on one and it came loose. "See there," he said. "It's off." "Well, yes, but you..." "Dang snakes," Gramps said, pulling at another one. It came loose. "Looky there, another one." The woman smiled a thin, little, worried smile. But 2 hours later, there was not a single snake still attached to anything to which it was supposed to be attached. The carbusterator lay dismantled on the ground. Various other pieces of the woman's engine were scattered here and there. The woman called a mechanic, and once Gramps was satisfied that the mechanic was an honest man who might actually be able to repair her car, we started on our trip again. "Salamanca," Graham said, "tell us more about Phoebe." "Phoebe," I said. "Phoebe Winterbottom." "Yes, that's right," Graham said. "Phoebe." Okay, that's the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6 is called Blackberries. So chapter 5 is just kind of giving you some insight into Graham and Gramps' characters. As you can see, Gramps is trying to be nice, but maybe not as helpful as he thinks he is by pulling apart that woman's engine. So Blackberries, they're still on the road trip, and Sal is going to explain more about the story of what happened with her and Phoebe. So chapter 6 starts on page 26. Blackberries. What was the diabolic thing that happened to Mr. Cadaver? Gramps asked. You didn't tell us that yet. I explained that just as Phoebe was going to divulge the purely awful thing that had happened to Mr. Cadaver, her father came home from work, and we all sat down to dinner. Me, Phoebe, Mr. and Mrs. Winterbottom, and Phoebe's sister, Prudence. Phoebe's parents reminded me a lot of my other grandparents, the Pickfords. Remember that the Pickfords are Sal's mom's parents, not the one that she's on the road trip with. The one on the road trip are the Hiddles, and that's her dad's parents. Like the Pickfords, Mr. and Mrs. Winterbottom spoke quietly in short sentences and sat straight up as they ate their food. They were extremely polite to each other, saying, Yes, Norma, and yes, George, and would you please pass the potatoes, Phoebe? And wouldn't your guest like another helping? They were picky about their food. Everything they ate was what my father would call side dishes: potatoes, zucchini, bean salad, and a mystery casserole that I could not identify. They didn't eat meat, and they didn't use butter. They were very much concerned with cholesterol. From what I could gather, Mr. Winterbottom worked in an office creating road maps. Mrs. Winterbottom baked and cleaned and did laundry and grocery shopping. I had a funny feeling that Mrs. Winterbottom did not actually like all this baking and cleaning and laundry and shopping, and I'm not quite sure why I had that feeling, because if you just listen to the words she said, it sounded as if she was Mrs. Supreme Housewife. For example, at one point Mrs. Winterbottom said, I believe I've made more pies in the past week than I can count. She said this in a cheery voice, but afterward, in the small silence, when no one commented on her pies, she gave a soft sigh and looked down at her plate. I thought it was odd that she baked all those pies when she seemed so concerned about cholesterol. A little later, she said, I couldn't find exactly that brand of muesli you like so much, George, but I bought something similar. By the way, muesli is like a kind of like a granola type of cereal. Mr. Winterbottom kept eating, and again, in that silence, Mrs. Winterbottom sighed and examined her plate. I'm at the top of 28 now. I was happy for her when she announced that since Phoebe and Prudence were back in school, she thought she would return to work. Apparently, during the school terms, she worked part-time at Rocky's Rubber as a receptionist. When no one commented on her going back to work, she sighed again and poked her potatoes. A few times, Mrs. Winterbottom called her husband Sweetie Pie and Honey Bun. She said, Would you like more zucchini, Sweetie Pie? And, Did I make enough potatoes, Honey Bun? For some reason that surprised me, those little names she used. She was dressed in a plain brown skirt and white blouse. On her feet were sensible, wide, flat shoes. She did not wear makeup. Even though she had a pleasant round face and long curly yellow hair, the main impression I got was that she was used to being plain and ordinary and that she was not supposed to do anything too shocking. And Mr. Winterbottom was playing the role of father with a capital F. He sat at the head of the table with his white shirt cuffs rolled back neatly. He still wore his red and blue striped tie. His expression was serious, his voice was deep, and his words were clear. Yes, Norma, he said deeply and clearly. No, Norma. He looked more like 52 than 38, but this was not something I would ever call to his or Phoebe's attention. Phoebe's sister Prudence was 17 years old, but she acted like her mother. She ate primly, she nodded politely, she smiled after everything she said. It seemed peculiar. They acted so thumpingly tidy and respectable. So I'm going to pause for just a second. You have a question about part of that scene in your activities to do with this chunk. So this is kind of giving us a picture of what Phoebe's family is like versus what Sal's family is like. So it sounds like, you know, Sal had a really nice family life before her mom left, and she was used to the three of them being together, and it was kind of casual. And this family is more, I guess, formal, how they all sit together, and the mom is concerned about, you know, the food that she's made, and the father is very very fatherly in the way he acts, like, and that the Prudence is a lot like the mom. So she's just kind of thinking and feeling them out, seeing how the differences are between the two, what she's used to and what this family's like. After dinner, Phoebe walked me home. She said, "You wouldn't think it to look at her, but Mrs. Cadaver is as strong as an ox." Phoebe looked behind her as if she expected someone to be following us. "I have seen her chop trees and lug the remains clear across her backyard. Do you know what I think? I think maybe she killed Mr. Cadaver and chopped him up and buried him in the backyard." "Phoebe," I said. "Well, I'm just telling you what I think, that's all." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Mrs. Cadaver, and I wanted to believe that she was capable of killing her husband and chopping him into pieces and burying him in the backyard. So I'm going to pause because you have a question about that too. So just think about Mrs. Cadaver is Margaret Cadaver, the dad's friend that Sal seems to resent and not like. And just maybe think about the reasons why she doesn't like her or wishes to believe she's capable of killing her husband. If you hear noise in the background, I'm sorry, it's my dog going crazy. I'm not sure what to do about him because I'm not a professional YouTuber, and if I pause this video, I'm not sure it's going to start recording again. Okay, I'm going to try. I may have to pause it and go get him and divide this into 2 videos. No, he's running away. Okay, we're good. Sorry. Page 29. That night, oh no. And then I started. That's where I left off. Bottom of 29. And then I started thinking about the blackberries, and I remembered a time my mother and I walked around the rims of the fields and pastures and bybanks picking blackberries. We did not pick from the bottom of the vine or from the top. The ones at the bottom were for the rabbits, my mother said, and the ones at the top were for the birds. The ones at people height were for people. Lying in bed, remembering those blackberries made me think of something else, too. It was something that happened a couple of years ago on a morning when my mother slept late. It was that time she was pregnant. That's a big clue. That time she was pregnant. But there's no other child now, and Sal's mom's not around, so you're kind of supposed to think about that. Like, well, what happened to the baby? My father had already eaten breakfast, and he was out in the fields. On the table, my father had left a single flower in each of the 2 juice glasses, a black-eyed Susan in front of my place and a white petunia in front of my mother's. When my mother came into the kitchen that day, she said, "Glory." She bent her face toward each flower. "Let's go find him." We climbed the hill to the barn, crawled between the fence wires, and crossed the field. My father was standing at the far end of the field, his back to us, hands on his hips, looking at a section of fence. My mother slowed down when she saw him. I was right behind her. It looked as if she wanted to creep up and surprise him, so I was quiet too and cautious in my steps. I could hardly keep from giggling. It seemed so daring to be sneaking up on my father, and I was sure my mother was going to throw her arms around him and kiss him and hug him and tell him how much she loved the flower on the kitchen table. My mother always loved anything that normally grows or lives out of doors. Anything. Lizards, trees, cows, caterpillars, birds, flowers, crickets, toads, ants, pigs. Just before we reached my father, he turned around. This startled my mother and threw her off guard. She stopped. "Sugar," he said. My mother opened her mouth, and I was thinking, Come on, throw your arms around him. Tell him. But before she could speak, my father pointed to the fence and said, "Look at that, a morning's work." He indicated a new length of wire strung between two new posts. There was sweat on his face and arms. And then I saw that my mother was crying. My father saw it too. "What?" he said. "Oh, you're too good, John," she said. "You're too good. Oh, you Hiddles are too good. I'll never be so good. I'll never be able to think of all the things." My father looked down at me. "The flowers," I said. "Oh." He put his sweaty arms around her, but she was still crying, and it wasn't what I had imagined it would be. It was all sad instead of happy. The next morning when I went into the kitchen, my father was standing beside the table looking at two small dishes of blackberries, still shiny and wet with dew. One dish at his place and one at mine. "Thanks," I said. "No, it wasn't me," he said. "It was your mother." Just then she came in from the back porch. My father put his arms around her and they smooched, and it was all tremendously romantic, and I started to turn away, but my mother caught my arm. She pulled me to her and said to me, though it was meant for my father, I think, "See, I'm almost as good as your father." She said it in a shy way, laughing a little. I felt betrayed, but I didn't know why. It is surprising all the things you remember just by eating a blackberry pie. Okay, so that whole story kind of gives you some background into the relationship between Sal's mom and her dad, and shows that maybe there were some underlying issues with the way the mom thought about herself and felt in comparison to the dad. So writers don't usually include things in books that aren't meant to somehow show you something about the character or move the story forward. So you have to assume as a reader that, that is important and that it will come back to make sense as part of the story later. So this book reveals a lot of little details, a little at a time, and you just have to kind of be patient and let them build, and they will all come together. Okay? So my next video will be chapters 7 and 8, and until then, take care and have a good day. Bye.